For this car rendering, we're going to start with the drawing. The drawing is the most important part. We're going to block it out real light using an Intuos 4 and Adobe Photoshop CC. Going in with some more solid lines. Quickly sketching it out. Paying attention to form. Looking at our reference. The drawing doesn't exactly match the reference. I faked the perspective. I did lay in some construction lines that aren't really that visible on the screen. Sketching in the rim form. Adding a little bit of shading. Starting with a very light, loose line and tightening it up. Freehand lines. Using that Intuos 4 and Photoshop CC, warping the layer. Working on a separate sketch layer above the base background. Now I'm making some selections using the polygonal lasso tool. Blocking in some color to start to establish the form. Color picking from the image. I think I do that later. This is just standard colors in Photoshop that I'm using. I do color pick from an image that I've chosen for the layout of the highlights, a layout of the paint scheme. Working primarily on transitioning from core shadows into the surrounding midtones and then into the highlights. Trying to come to a better understanding of how tone and value work together to establish form. Laying in some mesh details here for this part of the headlamp. I'll lay in the details here real quick at first and then coming in to establish the details using just standard brushes, a hard brush and a soft brush, adjusting the opacity sometimes and sometimes the flow. This is going to be part of my focal point, so I really want it to have a fair amount of detail to give visual interest, to catch the eye. Real loose in the beginning, using the polygonal lasso to establish the hard edges of the selection, working within the selection, all on one layer, just a paint layer. Erasing parts of the drawing that I don't need, blocking in the windows, adding that edge to the window trim, blocking out the interior. Now I'm going to use some color picking to start to give me some interior color. And then I'm just going to rough it in. Doesn't have to have a lot of detail. It's going to be hidden by the frost of the glass that's going to go in eventually on the white layer. I use white as a separate layer so that I can lay out my highlights and erase them or adjust them as needed without affecting the underlying paint. I use the polygonal lasso to create my selections. And then typically what I'll do is I'll use quick mask mode, which is the small circle inside of the rectangle at the bottom of the tool set. Cleaning up the edges of the base paint layout. Rear tail light. Add some cut lines in paint and remove the sketch lines underneath using the eraser. Establishing the edge of that wheel well. Always reworking the sketch, drawing, redrawing in paint. Now the underskirt of that front fairing, right there under the door and the side of the body. Refining. There's going to be some bounce light coming up from the ground. I'm going to use a reflective ground. So now I'm color picking from the reference and starting to establish the paint on the panels. The purpose of this car rendering for me was to help develop my understanding of how light moves across an object. So I'm not trying to, or I'm trying not to just mindlessly copy what I see. I'm trying to understand why it is the way that it is. How does that work? How does the light move and create the shadows and create the highlights as it flows over an object? How does the environment affect an object? And I'm using studio lighting is what I chose for a reference to create the paint on this drawing. Strong drawing is the base of a good image. So in the beginning I just tried to establish a drawing that I flipped once or twice to make sure that it was solid. Now I'm going to make selections using the quick mask mode. Excuse me. Refine those selections and work on the components individually. Again, the quick mask, the polygonal lasso into the quick mask mode to refine the selection and then create the hard line using the brush, letting go of the selection and erasing the drawing underneath. Polygonal lasso to create that highlight edge that's catching the light. Throw some white in there, specular highlights. Really helps the image pop. Tinted the background so that my white stands out more and I can see more clearly what it is that I'm doing. I'm going to establish the lens over the light, frosting it with some white, adding some more white highlights to that vent. Part of the challenge of creating any image is figuring out how much detail and what you can fake and what's going to sell the image. How much detail do I need to put in there to convince the viewer that this is a real object? And I think that comes from experience, just doing multiple drawings, multiple paintings to figure out what you can fake. Establishing the roof line as it overlaps the door. Using the polygonal lasso, refining it with the quick mask mode. I'm going to establish the frosting of the glass, the reflection of the light. That's why I chose a vehicle for this project, because it gave me the opportunity to render many different types of materials, from matte materials to reflective materials, from plastics to chromes to aluminum. So really it's an exercise in light and materials, and trying to find a process, trying to find my way of rendering inside of Photoshop. I was an airbrush artist for many years, and here I'm trying to use the same tools that I used as an airbrush artist, friskets and films and layering of paint in order to create blended areas, in order to fool the eye that this object has weight and volume. So I'm blending here. I'm removing the drawing lines as I paint and establish cut lines with the brush. No special brushes, just the standard soft brush, and adjusting the opacity and the flow of the brush to create the transition between light and shadow, to create volume. This is the same red of the body, but it's picking up the ground, and it's not in the light, but it's still receiving some bounce light. like that, so I redo it. I didn't really like the shape I was getting. I put some highlights on there to help the eye travel around the object. All the body lines point to that front fender area, and that's going to be my focal area, is that front rim, front fender area. So keeping that in mind as I move through the image, I let some of the objects that are further from my focal point blend into the background by not giving them too much detail and softening the lines as I move away from my focal area. So the details here aren't quite as important. I don't want as much contrast. I don't want things to pop quite as much here, but I do want it to have some appeal. A little bit of light. I added that in there. There are some lines that I'm adding that aren't in the reference, which I think is important to exercise your artistic creativity and not just be a slave to your reference, but use your reference to teach you how things actually work. How do body lines work on a real vehicle? Understanding these things helps us move on to create our own concepts where we don't have reference, creating things that don't exist by learning from things that do. So this right here, this wheel well, will be attached to the paint layer, and then the tire will be a separate unit, the rim, the brake assembly, so that I can affect those without affecting the paint. So here I'm going to really focus on this area, separating the elements piece by piece, adding to the selection, add a light color, a light gray, and now I'm going to drop the drawing out and just start focusing on building the form using simple values of simple shades of gray. In the end, I think I have a total of 5. I start with just 3 shades of gray to establish the form. Make the selection and begin to work within the selection. This component, this star component of the rim, is on its own separate layer, so that I can lock the pixels, lock the transparency, and work just on that layer without going outside of the lines later on. But in the beginning, I'm just working inside of that selection. Now I add another. Using the ellipse tool, I add color to the background components of the rim and the tire itself. You can't, once you make an ellipse, you can't actually adjust the ellipse, but once you fill it with color, you can adjust the object on its own layer. Now I use the chalk brush to create a texture, different shades of gray, and pressure on the Wacom tablet to establish the disc in the background, the center of the disc. And now I'm going to freehand the caliper using the polygonal lasso tool. I didn't draw that caliper in there, so I established the form with paint. Now refining the rim. That's a nice thing about Photoshop, is that you can continually refine your image. You don't have to spend so much time getting it perfect in the beginning. But you do want to be as close to the finish as possible. But the bonus of Photoshop is that you can always change it. Whereas when you lay down paint on an image, if it's gone, it's gone. If it's too far gone, sometimes you just can't fix it. I don't know anybody personally that still uses airbrushing and flat work in their artwork. But that's where I learned how to create form, how to colorize form, was with an airbrush. That was before Photoshop even existed. I was airbrushing. So using the rules of materials when rendering reflective surfaces, use warms and browns and blues to establish the reflection of the environment. So I've done that there in that little area of the rim. I used a blue-gray and a brown-gray to establish reflection of the ground and the sky. Even though we're in a studio environment, it'll still sell. Now I've copied the rim layer and adjusted its levels. There doesn't have to be a lot of detail in that logo, so I created the logo and then I blurred it. I used a Gaussian blur. I'll do the same thing here, Gaussian blur. And that's pretty much it for the rim. Now I'm going to finish that caliper with the red line under Ferrari. And that's that. Little adjustment here, that was a bit too dark. It looked funny as you zoomed out from the image. Now I'm going to start to focus on the tire, establishing the rubber material using browns and purples, violets. Black is never really truly black. It's always got color in it. Understanding color is very important. Understanding how you can use a complementary color in the shadow to really help the image pop. These things are important, although this image really isn't about color. It's more about form and light. So using the chalk brush to fake in edges, writing, the tread. There's going to be bounce light coming up from underneath of the object, which justifies that little highlight inside of that wheel well. I've copied the front tire, put it on another layer, and moved it to the back. And now I'm finishing out the rear tire, as well as the wheel well, which I married to the paint layer, and I used the chalk brush there. Refine the edges freehand using the hard round and the soft round. Now I've copied the rim, and I'm using warp and transform and skew to create the perspective on that rear rim, creating the areas that didn't exist on the front rim, looking at my reference to that way I don't have to re-render the entire rear rim again. The power of Photoshop. The rear rim catches more light, and it doesn't have to have as much detail, too distracting. Faking in the rear caliper, totally faking that. Just creating little bits of this and that to try to make it look like it's in back of. Finishing out with some highlights. That's good. Adding some see-through areas where you can see through. And I'll put a blur on that entire rim so that it doesn't grab as much. It doesn't look quite in perspective though, so I readjust it. Readjust the tire. Flip it. Always flip your image. Get a different perspective on it. Look at the drawing, skew it, stretch it, transform it until you like it. Looks good. Now I'll blend in the tire. I can always go in and repaint. Blend in the wheel well. This image is just moving right along now. Freehanding the edges. Cleaning it up. Now we'll go in and erase the drawing. Erase the drawing. Clean up the sketch layer. Flip the image. Now it's about cleaning, refining, deciding if I like what I have so far. That edge looks a little hard right there, so I'm going to blend to make it look more rounded. It looked like it was flat, like it was a hard cut, but in actuality on this car, that's a nice rounded curve, Ferrari has such nice round curves versus Lamborghini, which typically has much harder lines, more aggressive lines. Ferrari generally softer, sexier than Lamborghini, which cuts, looks aggressive. So now I'm going to establish that front logo. I got reference online. Couldn't really see it in my reference. So I'm just using white and hard round, soft round, now some black. You can get away with a lot when something's that small. Now I'm going to go on a different layer, the paint layer, and I'm going to, just above the paint layer, and add the shadow. That looks good. Add that frontal logo. Faking the details. Add some green, some highlights. Something's funky with the layer. I did something, I don't have time to figure it out, so I just move on. I clean up this area right here and get ready to lay in that side logo. Typically I'll just block it in with white, make a selection, fill it with yellow. There we go. Get some reference on it. Start to build the logo. Add the colors. Sketch out the horse. Looks good. Doesn't have to be perfect. I put a Gaussian blur on that. Marry it into the background. Create the side light. If I don't like the placement, I can finish it out and move it. It's on its own layer. The power of layers. I add a little bit of highlight here to these panels, which were just dead. They had no life to them whatsoever. I fake a highlight on the rear light. I like it. So now I flatten the image, save a copy of it, translate it, transform it, add a gradient to the background layer, and start to airbrush in the edges, create a highlight, vignette, direct the eye to where I want people to look. I refine my selection in quick mask mode, which I've turned back to its red color, and I brush in the highlight or the shadow working from the vehicle out, and create an adjustment layer to bring the image together using a cool in the background to accentuate the warms of the vehicle, to create contrast. And I make a copy of the layer. I skew it, transform it, warp it, flip it, and sign it. And that's it. That's the completed image. So the focus being towards the front of the vehicle, and overall I'm satisfied. I think that's successful. Thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed it.